The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
So good evening to all of you. You should be able to see my screen coming up. And we're very, very excited this evening. Dr. Anthea Jeffery is online with myself. I had the privilege of listening to her speak. It was about, 3 weeks ago at the Ruder event in Johannesburg. And I was absolutely flabbergasted by what she was sharing with us as South Africans. And one thing that she said was that we need to be aware of what is going on. And so what we did is that we've asked her to join us, and she's very kindly agreed with us to share what she actually shared at that Rota presentation. Because again, as South Africans, we actually have a responsibility, if we're passionate about our country, to know what's going on in our country so that we can make the right decisions going forward. If I can just ask a quick questions. For those of you who don't know, you'll see that there's a little question box up in the right-hand corner. If you could just let me know if you can see the screen clearly, and if the sound's coming through clearly, and I just want to make sure that everything's working clearly. And Dr. Anthea Jeffery, it's awesome to have you online.
Thank you.
Excellent. So
it's good to be here.
Thank you very much. So Clive Miller, everyone says it's clear, and yes, so I just wanted to double check. There's nothing worse than you and me talking away and no one else can hear us, basically. So I think Leonardo da Vinci said simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And I think in life, many, many people try and confuse things. And I just wanted to start tonight and just kind of set the scene as to what it was we were trying to achieve by today. And some of our clients and people that know me know that I've got some very important driving elements as to why I do what I do. And I always say to people, if you're clear on what the why is, then you'll figure out the how and the what. And what most people aren't clear on is the why. They try and focus just on the how and the what. And I think, what you're going to share tonight for me is absolutely fascinating, because it really clearly teaches me what is going on with the why, and gives me reasons that I need to look at. And for me as an individual, some of my important drivers are that for my family, I want peace of mind. I want to know that I've got strategies for whatever scenarios take place so that I've got the peace of mind. I want to protect my wealth preservation. We spend decades building up our wealth, and we want to make sure. And I think what Dr. Anthony is going to share with us tonight is that people have built up their wealth, and they need to be very aware of what's happening in the laws to protect that wealth. They need to have a plan B so that no matter what happens, whether it's A, B, C, or D, it doesn't matter. They've got a plan B. And then lastly, for me, something that I'm extremely passionate about is freedom. And I don't care where people want to live. I don't care where they want to send their kids to school or what they want to donate to charity. But what I do care about is that people have the freedom to make the choices that they want. And I want to just explain that and where that comes from. And for those of you who don't know a little bit about my history, but effectively it sounds a bit like the rich dad, poor dad, but I effectively had two brothers. Half my family is from Zimbabwe. So my father, there were two brothers. My father left Zim in 1976. He had no plan. He literally reacted, and unfortunately lived an entire life of reaction. And don't worry, Dr. Jeffery, that's not my father, but I just thought it was a fairly humorous picture of someone, literally leaving without a plan. On the other hand, my uncle in 1980 opened an offshore bank account. He invested in Zim. He made a lot of money in Zim, but he always had a plan B. And in 2003, he decided it was time to move to Australia. And I'm not saying I want to move to Australia, and I'm not saying it's good to move to Australia. But what I do think is important is that if you want to do something, it's the freedom to be able to do it. And he bought his way in at the age of 53. He bought a house for cash. He sent his kid to one of the best private schools, and subsequently his kid has actually been offered bursaries at some of the best universities in the world. And I always joke, but one of the best things was he never had to work for an Australian. And this all comes back to kind of one of my drivers. And I set myself up in life where there were two things. One is I love property, and one is that I wanted to be in control of my destiny. And I literally did my first property project when I was 13, where I persuaded my folks to extend on my brother's bedroom, and we basically built this two-bedroom bathroom extension on the house. We did our first property development, 6 units down in Rondebosch in Cape Town at 22, our first London one at 24, and subsequently created a company that's helped thousands of South Africans invest in South Africa, London, Australia, the USA, and also in commercial property. And why is this all relevant? Well, the context of what I think is really important is, and it wasn't just the residential stuff. There's a lot of commercial opportunities both in Australia, America, and the UK as well. But why is this important? And I think the most important thing is that I've done a lot of work with Clem Sunter, who's one of the world's most recognized scenario planners. And what I found fascinating is that most people go along and they'll hear Clem Sunter speak, and he's got these different scenarios as to where both the global economy is going, where the South African economy is going. And what I found fascinating is I can't predict the future any better than anyone else. But Clem and his partner have, her name Chantal Ilbury, have a very, very sophisticated formula to plan on where the different scenarios are going, and then ultimately to make decisions based on those different scenarios. And I created a 4-dimensional model, which we put on top of Clem's scenario planning model, and he actually endorsed it and said to me, I should write a book. And in simple terms, I'm not going to spend any time today. If anyone wants to go and read the book, it's Property Going Global. If you just type in there PGG, I'll send it to you for free. But the point being is that whether you look at the global scenarios, whether you look at the South African scenarios, it all actually comes down to flags. And the way that he decides, he's got us 50% in the Premier League here in South Africa, 25% in the second division, and 25% in failed state. Now, if you want to know more about that, go read the book or get the book, or I can explain it at the Wealth Movement event. But tonight is not about me or about the book. Tonight is about Dr. Anthea Jeffery. Because for me, the way that he decides his scenario planning brings up flags. And those flags give a greater probability to a different scenario. And those scenarios give a greater probability as to where we should be investing and what we should be doing in our life. And it's how we created the global property system and the 4-dimensional model. But the best way to describe flags that most people understand is that if you're from Joburg and you go swimming in the sea down in Cape Town and there's a green flag, well, you're pretty safe. Like, there's no sharks in the water. But if you see a white flag, then that is really dangerous. It's probably a great white, and you should get out of the water as quickly as you possibly can because it's in danger of your life. And for me personally, as I said to you, 3 weeks ago, I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Anthea Jeffery, and she was presenting what is happening in South Africa, how they are looking to change the laws. Now, some of you will know we've done some great webinars in the past. We've had the Land Affairs Minister and great economists, etc. But for me, when she went through it in a methodical way, I was really, really awoken is the best way to describe it. And for me, there were a lot of red flags. And so without further ado, I wanted to really introduce you, just so that for those of you who don't know who you are, you've got a lawyer's degree from the University of the Witwatersrand, cum laude. I always like the cum laude people. I also cum laude my degrees, and those you put in some proper time and effort there. You've got a LLM from the University of Cambridge, a PhD in human rights law from the University of London. You've been a lecturer and worked at multiple law firms, but currently is the head of policy research at the Institute of Race Relations, where she has worked since 1990. She's authored 11 books. And I think most importantly, she's one of the most respected people in South Africa in terms of policy change, labor law, employment equity, BE, expropriation, mining law, property valuation, line restitution, copyright, etc., protection of foreign investments. And the reason why I think this is so pertinent is that this is everything that we speak about. And so without further ado, I wanted to just hand over to you, and she's going to share with us what is actually happening and really awaken us as South Africans. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what's happening. What matters is whether you know what's happening and can therefore make decisions based on what's happening. And the last thing that I would like to say, just while we swap over the screens here, is would you mind just telling us a little bit about the Institute of Race Relations, what it is, what its purpose is, for those who are not 100% sure?
Sure, Scott. The IRR, or the Institute of Race Relations, was formed many years ago, in fact in 1929, to oppose racial discrimination in South Africa and promote racial goodwill. And we were the first anti-apartheid organization before the National Party had come to power or the word apartheid had been coined. And we became experts in all aspects of policy in South Africa. We wanted to look at everything that was affected by racial laws, and that was pretty much the whole policy spectrum, right through from business operation to labor, education, health, and so on. And we began producing an annual yearbook called the South Africa Survey, which brought all this information together. And that yearbook has now been in operation since 1946. We've brought it out pretty consecutively since then. So we have a huge store of mostly statistical information on which to base our policy analysis. Plus, we keep a very close eye on all developments in the country across the same broad range of policy issues.
Okay, fantastic. So, Dr. Jeffery, I've made you the presenter. If you can just, oh, there you are, you've accepted it. Fantastic. So you've now got full control of the screen, and we look forward to your enlightenment.
Thank you to you and to everybody who's participating in this webinar and giving me the opportunity to talk about an issue that I regard as terribly important, the growing threat to property rights in South Africa. And there are many threats in many areas, and they come primarily from various recent acts which have already been adopted by Parliament and from various bills that are already still going through the legislature. Many of them affect the agricultural sector and land in general, and I'll draw particular attention to the Expropriation Bill of 2015 because that is very important and I need to spend a little time on it. Also very important is Black Economic Empowerment, or BEE, especially the new generic codes of good practice that were gazetted by our Department of Trade and Industry back in 2013 and which came into effect from the 1st of May 2015 this year. So they're now in operation and they hold major ramifications for business. Also significant are bills affecting the private security industry and also the mining and oil and gas industries, which I'll touch rather briefly on. So let me start with land issues and the reopening of the land claims process. Just for a bit of background, land reform in South Africa includes an element called restitution, which aims to restore to Black people land which they lost under various racial laws after 1913. And there was an initial process. Claims had to be put in before the end of December 1998. About 80,000 claims were put in. About 8 to 10,000 of them still remain unresolved. But now we have a second round, a reopening of the land claims process, and that's been put in motion under an Amendment Act which took effect on the 1st of July 2014. And since then, some 56,000 new claims have already been lodged, and the government is actively soliciting new claims by sending out minibuses to remote corners of the country to invite people to lodge claims. The new window will be open until June 2019, so there's a 5-year period in all. And according to the state's own regulatory impact analysis, some 379,000 new claims are anticipated, which could cost 179 billion rand to settle. But the state can't afford to pay 179 billion in compensation. Just to give you an illustration, our budget for land restitution is less than 3 billion a year. So even over 5 years, it won't amount to more than 15 billion. So how are we to find this kind of sum? Another problem is that the land claims that have been lodged have sometimes been inflated. Sometimes they've been gazetted without adequate proof. And in general, the whole process has been very prolonged, very inefficient, and it's taken a long time to investigate claims. Even where settlements have been reached, it can take years for landowners to be paid out. And the result is that, according to Agri-SA, one of our key farming associations, the land claims process has been more damaging to farming than was the Anglo-Boer War. Claims may, of course, cover not only farming land, but also residential land or land which is used for commercial, industrial, or mining purposes. Land which is held in communal traditional ownership can also be claimed, as can state-owned land. And all of this has come very sharply to the fore from the gazetting earlier this year of a claim to much of Pretoria North, Pretoria being our administrative capital. And the claims there cover land of all these varieties, and including Mamelodi, which is one of the biggest black townships in the Gauteng area.
Is it true that
as soon as
Sorry, Dr. Jeffrey. Is it true that the king of the Zulus, Zwelithini, has put a land claim over the whole of KZN?
He's planning to claim the entire area which was held by the Zulu monarch around about 1883, but hasn't yet done so, but that certainly seems to be the intention. And of course, once a claim is gazetted but hasn't yet been settled, nobody quite knows who's going to end up owning the land. So it creates great uncertainty as to title, and as we see in this Pretoria North example, it means that people are very reluctant to buy, and the banks are very reluctant to extend mortgage finance over sales in any event because they're not sure of how strong their collateral is. So it has a very chilling effect on the property market. I'm going to move now to the Property Valuation Act of 2014, which took effect on the 1st of August 2015, so a little over a month ago. And the main purpose of this act is to establish a new office of the Valuer General. And the Valuer General is a state official. He's appointed by the minister, and he's accountable to the minister, but he's nevertheless supposed to function independently. His role is to value all property, both land plus accompanying movables, which is targeted for land reform. So that, of course, would include all the land which is now being claimed under the new land claims process. Valuations are supposed to be based partly on market value, to which, of course, a monetary value can be assigned, but also on factors such as the current use of the property and the history of its acquisition. And it's very difficult, of course, to know how the Valuer General will assign a monetary value to factors such as those. So that makes for uncertainty. In addition, the Minister will be able to lay down criteria and guidelines in the Government Gazette from time to time. So there's no certainty here either as to what those guidelines and criteria might hold. I want to move on now to the Agri-Land Bill of 2014. I call it that for short because it has a long and complicated name. The full name is the Preservation and Development of Agricultural Land Framework Bill. The key thing about it is that under its terms, the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, or DAF for short, is to be the custodian of all agricultural land on behalf of the people of South Africa. Now, that particular wording rings all sorts of bells because it echoes another act with a long name, the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, which previously vested all mineral resources in the state as custodian for the benefit of all the people of South Africa. And we have a very important and interesting constitutional court judgment on the meaning of the MPRDA. In essence, what the Constitutional Court found was that there is no expropriation where the state acquired custodianship rather than ownership. And I think I just need to spend a little bit of time explaining that. This case arose in 2001 when a company called Sebenza bought a coal mining right which had never been used, for which it paid R1 million. Then the MPRDA came into effect in 2004 and it vested all mineral resources in the custodianship of the state. It also said that all existing mining rights, now called old order mining rights, had to be transformed into new order mining rights granted by the mining ministry within a specified time. For unused mining rights, the period was 1 year. But Sebenza couldn't apply for its old order mining right to be converted because it lacked the 1.5 million application fee. It was in fact in severe financial difficulties. And so its old order unused mining rights ceased to exist after a year. But Sebenza had paid R1 million for it. So it claimed compensation from the government on the basis that it had been expropriated. And the Pretoria High Court upheld that claim and granted damages of 750,000 rand. But when the matter went to the Constitutional Court, that court effectively laid down a new principle of law. It said for there to be an expropriation, you need a deprivation of ownership on the one hand and a matching acquisition of ownership by the state on the other. that here the state had not acquired ownership, it had only acquired custodianship. And so there was no expropriation, and so there was no compensation to be paid. And this was a very different approach from the Pretoria Court's case, because that court had taken the view that whether you call it custodianship or ownership, in fact the state has all the competencies of ownership that previously vested in Sebenza, and you shouldn't split hairs over terminology. Be that as it may, it's the Constitutional Court judgment that prevails, and it has set this apparent precedent. Then under the Agri-Land Bill, there's also a provision saying that the right to farm is to be subject to ministerial regulation. So there is indeed a possibility that in future the minister will say that farmers can farm provided they enter into a lease with DAF, and that lease may be made conditional on their meeting various BEE requirements, just as the right to mine under the MPRDA is made dependent on meeting BEE requirements under the Mining Charter. We don't know if that will happen, but if it does, a demand by the economic freedom fighters, the EFF, for the state to have custodianship of all farming land and then grant leases to farmers will certainly have come close to being realized. Other rather worrying provisions of the Agri-Land Bill: farmers will need the state's consent for any rezoning or subdivision, but these concepts are very widely defined, and it's possible that consent would be needed where a farmer merely seeks to change from one agricultural use to another. If that is the case, this will have a devastating impact on commercial agriculture. In addition, farmland which is not being used optimally, according to the minister, may be expropriated at less than market value. But of course, in this situation, no compensation may be payable if the approach by the Constitutional Court in that Agri-SA case is followed. In other words, if the state has custodianship rather than ownership, there's no expropriation, and so there's no compensation. Other proposed land reform measures, just to rather skip over these. First of all, there's a 50-50 proposal for farmers and farm workers, in terms of which farmers would be expected to transfer 50% of their farms to long-serving farm workers, and then farm workers would join with farmers in trusts which would run the farms, and presumably those trusts would also be in a 50-50 basis. So it's not clear whether the farmer would still have management control. Land ceilings are to be introduced, 1,000 hectares for small farms, 2,500 hectares for medium-sized ones, and 5,000 hectares for large farms. For many farms, these ceilings won't be a problem, but there are also a significant number of farms which are bigger than these ceilings, and where farmers might find the excess being expropriated by the state. There are also to be limits on the ownership of farmland by foreigners. And in addition, there will be many more rights excuse me, for farm residents. For example, it was mooted in 2010 that farm residents should have the right to do commercial farming on a farmer's land, which obviously would set up conflict with the farmer himself, who was also trying to do commercial farming. There's now very little chance of freehold title being extended to some 8 million people who hold plots which are subject to communal land ownership and are mostly found in the former homeland areas. At one point it was possible, or certainly it was mooted, that these 18 million people would be able to acquire individual ownership. Now they will have to rest content with institutional land use rights, falling far short of individual ownership and probably not enough to satisfy banks' requirements for collateral. And often the sad thing about land reform measures is that we're not really providing redress. Black South Africans in most instances are still not able to acquire ownership of land. It's the state that's acquiring the land. So what we have is a kind of creeping land nationalization rather than effective redress for apartheid wrongs. And I want to turn to the expropriation bill and to give an example drawn from the urban environment, because this expropriation bill will apply, of course, not only to farming land, but to property of all kinds. But let's take the example of what the city of Johannesburg might want to do. The city has been talking of creating social housing, more dense housing, along what it calls the corridors of freedom. These are key roads which link the suburbs to the city centre and which offer the people living along them good transport routes. Take, for example, Orange Grove, for anybody who knows Johannesburg, and Louis Botha Avenue, which runs through it, which is an area where there's both residential and commercial property owned now by both black and white people. The City of Johannesburg would have to start by conducting preliminary negotiations with all the relevant property owners and with investigating values. It would have to invite objections to expropriation, but it could dismiss those objections without even having to give reasons. And after those preliminary processes had been finalized, it could serve notices of expropriation on all the relevant property owners on, say, the 1st of November. And ownership would then pass to the City of Johannesburg automatically by operation of law on whatever date of expropriation is set out in the notice, which could be as soon as the 8th of November, because there are no relevant time limits in the bill other than a clause saying that you can't have the date of expropriation the day before the notice was served. The right to possess the property will pass automatically to the city, and again that could happen very quickly, say on the 15th of November, but payment could be promised for a significantly later date, say the 1st of March 2016, and that payment could of course be late because unfortunately many of our municipalities and government departments are notoriously late in fulfilling their payment obligations. Compensation could be set at market value, let's say 30%, because much will depend on what value is assigned to factors such as the history of the acquisition of the property or its current use. If the owners don't sue for more, sorry, there's a bit of a glitch there, within 60 days, they are deemed to have accepted the compensation offered by the city, which is a very important limitation. It's a big decision to litigate. You have only 60 days to work out whether it's worth doing so, and you run a big risk if you do, because if owners sue and in the end they get less than the amount that was offered, the state's legal costs are deducted from the compensation due to them, and they get only the balance. And if the dispute does go to court, the court, on the current wording of the bill, can rule on the amount of compensation, but not on whether the expropriation is valid at all. And that, of course, is very important because Section 25 of our Constitution, part of the Bill of Rights, has criteria for a valid expropriation. For example, it mustn't be irrational or arbitrary. It must objectively be in the public interest as defined in the Bill of Rights, and it must be accompanied by just and equitable compensation. And if any of those criteria are not fulfilled, then the expropriation is not in fact valid. So if a dispute arises during failed negotiations at the outset of the process, then the state must prove that these criteria are met, and it must do so before it proceeds with the expropriation, as otherwise all those guarantees mean very little in practice. In addition, Section 34 of the Constitution guarantees access to court, but the expropriation bill is in breach of it. First of all, it doesn't currently allow any court to rule on the validity of the expropriation, and it has this deeming provision which bars access to court even the amount of compensation. In addition, Section 33 of the Constitution guarantees administrative justice, for example, procedural fairness. But here we have the City of Johannesburg being able to act as judge and jury in its own cause. And in addition, Section 26 of the Constitution says no one may be evicted from their home without a court order authorizing this. And of course, in this Louis Botha example, many of the property owners would own homes along that road.
Dr. Jeffery,
so the IRR, yes.
Just a quick question. For someone like myself, who's fairly naive to this stuff, every country in the world has expropriation. If they need to build a big highway, it's in the interest of the public to be able to expropriate a house so that they can build a highway so we don't have, bridges like they do in Cape Town that don't meet up. But what is the
Right.
difference with this? I mean, so, from what I understand from you, there's strategic ill intent versus what's in the best interest of society. What's the difference exactly?
I think perhaps the difference is best captured by contrasting this bill with what our current Expropriation Act says. That, like expropriation legislation elsewhere in the world, says the state can expropriate for public purposes, such as the building of a road. It also says that the owner is entitled to full compensation to the market value of the property, plus an amount to make good all losses resulting from the expropriation. For example, moving costs, or what it costs to buy a new house or another business or new business premises. And there will also, of course, be losses of future income, at least for a period. All of that would be covered under our existing Expropriation Act. Very little of it will be available under the Expropriation Bill. In addition, the Expropriation Bill allows expropriation in the public interest, which is what the Constitution says. But the Constitution limits the public interest to land reform and attempts to bring about more equitable access to natural resources. The Expropriation Bill goes further than that, and it says basically the public interest will also be satisfied wherever there's a need for some sort of redress for past discrimination. So in our Orange Grove example, if black people couldn't buy land there in the past and weren't able to gain access to dense housing close to transport nodes and work, then there would be an element of redress in that. It wouldn't meet the definition of land reform. It wouldn't give more equitable access to natural resources. So the Expropriation Bill is trying to go beyond what the Constitution sanctions. And it's also, because of the process it sets up, it means that people can lose ownership and possession before the state has ever even had to prove that its expropriation is in line with the Constitution. So great harm can be done. And even if in the end the state recognizes that an expropriation is not constitutional, people have lost their homes, lost their business premises in the meantime. And that's not something which should readily be sanctioned. It really means that we're sort of driving a coach and horses through the property clause in the Bill of Rights.
And what's the intention there? I mean, what is in terms of, is it effectively to be able to have the freedom to be effectively like Zimbabwe, where you can do what you want? Or is there a better intention at heart?
Well, perhaps we should come to that towards the end when I talk what I think is the underlying tension behind all these erosions of property rights. But I think, again, you must remember that it's not individual black South Africans who are going to end up with ownership. It's the state that's going to own. And the intention does seem to be to build the power of the state in many ways, to make sure that it owns or controls as much property as possible. And this is not effective redress for individuals. This is state empowerment and, again, a form of nationalization. But let me come to that in a little bit more detail further on when I talk about underlying motivations. So we're proposing an alternative bill. We are recognizing that there's a need in some circumstances for expropriation, but say, if a dispute arises, let the City of Johannesburg or any other expropriating authority start by proving that its proposed expropriation is indeed constitutionally valid. And if it gets a court order confirming that, then it issues a notice of expropriation under which ownership and possession pass to it. That compensation should be based on market value and these discount factors that we have in the Constitution, but it should also include an amount to make good all direct losses, such as moving costs, as I was previously mentioning. This is already in the Expropriation Act, and it's not barred by the Constitution. And in addition, the City of Johannesburg should have to pay in full 15 days before ownership is to pass to it, because otherwise there's just too much of a risk that the payment will be very late. There's always also, of course, risks to banks and the mortgage market in the provisions of the bill, because under the Expropriation Bill, a mortgage will end when ownership passes to, say, the City of Johannesburg. But the amount of compensation, which will be less than market value, may not be enough to cover the amount of the outstanding loan, which is a big worry for banks. And in addition, the bank only gets paid when it and the owner agree on how that limited compensation is to be apportioned between them. And if they can't agree, then they have to go to get a court order on what the apportionment should be. And getting a court order can obviously take 2 to 3 years. So for a long period, a bank will be in limbo. And at the end of the day, it may find that what it gets paid is less than the amount of the outstanding loan. So there's a real risk that mortgage loans won't be paid in full, and this will make banks very nervous about extending mortgage finance. Hence, the Banking Association of South Africa has also objected to the bill. We have to see what happens. I want to move now to risks in the new BEE generic codes very briefly. The BEE ownership target is still 25% under these new codes, but there are other elements that need to be taken into account. For example, on preferential procurement. Let me start first of all with the rules that apply to larger enterprises, which are defined as companies which have annual turnover, not profit, annual turnover of more than 50 million rand. They are supposed to buy 80% of the goods and services they need each year from BEE firms. Under the old codes, you could buy those goods and services from BEE firms with 25% ownership, black ownership. But now, under the new rules, you have to buy at least 52% of those goods and services from 51% black-owned firms, or 30% black woman-owned. But those firms are scarce on the ground too. To look at the rules for preferential procurement for qualifying small enterprises, or QSEs, these are firms with annual turnover of between 10 million and 50 million rand, and they are supposed to buy 60% of their goods and services from BEE firms. In their case, 15% should come from 51% black-owned firms. And if you fail to meet these targets, this is a priority element, so your level of BEE contribution will be reduced by one level, which will make it more difficult for many firms to do business at all. Then there's the enterprise and supplier development element, in terms of which larger firms must devote 3% of net profit after tax, or NPAT, and qualifying small enterprises must put 2% of NPAT into building up new enterprises. But now, under these rules, those new enterprises have to be 51% black-owned, which is not a requirement that applied before. We also have some other anomalies. For example, Eskom demands 51% BEE ownership, not 26%, which is what the MPRDA says, from all its coal suppliers. And the Public Works Department in practice wants 51% BEE ownership before it will enter into a long 10-year lease for office premises. So many companies are in practice coming under pressure to do 51% BEE deals, to transfer 51% of their equity or assets to black South Africans. But this amounts to an indirect expropriation. The state doesn't acquire ownership, but the existing owner loses many of the powers and benefits of ownership. So that's indirect expropriation according to international rules, but it's very unlikely to be recognized as such under the expropriation bill. If I can turn to other threats in brief, there's the Private Security Industry Regulation Amendment Bill, the SIRA bill, under which foreign security companies must be 51% South African owned. And many people have expressed a fear, and I think those close to the ANC have also hinted that this could be the beginning of wider indigenization requirements that will in time be extended to other sectors. Then there's the Mining Amendment Bill, which may still give the Minister, the Mining Minister, let me say, the power to decide on both the prices and on whether strategic minerals can be exported. Again, this comes close to an indirect expropriation because owners lose many of the present powers and benefits of ownership. Then there are the oil provisions in that statute, which at the moment entitle the state to 20% free carried interest, plus a possible further 80% stake at whatever price the state is willing to agree. And because it's entitled to that further stake, it has a very strong negotiating position. Then there are also threats to patent rights and to other forms of intellectual property, most recently in a copyright amendment bill, which also has major implications for patent rights. But let me move on to look at why all these threats are coming up, particularly at a time when foreign direct investment is already severely down. In fact, it's turned negative in 2014 and the first quarter of 2015. We have more direct investment flowing out of the country than flowing in. Growth in the second quarter of 2015 was negative, minus 1.3%. The jobs crisis shows no signs of being solved. If anything, unemployment remains stubbornly high, and especially so for youths, for people between the ages of 15 and 24. And to my mind, all these policies that I've been talking about are part of the National Democratic Revolution, or the NDR, to which the ANC has been committed for decades, since 1969 to be precise. And one of the key goals of the National Democratic Revolution is to eliminate existing property rights. And if you look at what the South African Communist Party says, it's very clear that the NDR offers the most direct path to socialism and then communism in this country. And the SACP is not just a splinter group in South Africa. It probably has very little electoral support, but it has major representation in the Zuma cabinet. At least 40% of cabinet ministers or their deputies are known present or past members of the SACP, and a number of others are likely to be communists, though they have never acknowledged their membership of the party. So the SACP is very much not under the bed, but on top in South Africa, and it has, I think, a level of dominance and influence which is not adequately recognized. In addition, the ANC has an interest in reducing property rights, increasing dependency on the state, because that will help it hold on to power. We can see from our analysis of past election results and voting patterns that the people who support the ANC are the most unskilled, generally the unemployed, the people who very much turn to the state for social grants and a host of other transfers, who are deeply dependent on the state and reluctant to vote against the ANC. It's the middle class that's much more likely to turn towards the DA or other opposition parties. So if the ANC wants to hold on to power, it actually has good reason not to see the expansion of the middle class. At the same time, we have in this country some very important countervailing factors. To begin with, we have critical voices and a strong tradition of critical vigilance. We have opposition parties, we have a media that's often very outspoken, we have a vibrant civil society. We have a still strong private sector, which offers about 70% of the jobs in the country. So there is, of course, still great scope to attain prosperity without having to depend on the state. There's growing anger over things like Eskom's inefficiency and the corruption at Nkandla, President Zuma's private residence. And the state seems to be approaching a fiscal cliff. The demands on the public purse are increasing. Public service wages are going ever up, so too are social grants, but growth is faltering and so too are tax revenues, while debt is growing all the time. So we may reach a point where the government really doesn't have the resources that it needs. And there's also what might be called a verkramte split within the ANC. This harks back to the days of National Party rule, when some elements within the National Party became enlightened or verligte enough to want reform, whereas others were seen as the verkramtes. They were determined to hang on to the old policies, the old ideologies. And there seems to be a similar division within the ANC, with a more ideological element and a more conservative, pragmatic element. And sound alternative policies are being crafted by opposition parties, by civil society organizations such as the IRR, which has crafted a 12-point plan for prosperity, which would see the private sector being given much more of a role, the role of the state being drawn back, and an emphasis on economic growth rather than redistribution. And we also believe that it's possible to wage and win a battle of ideas using our opposition parties, our free media, our civil society, we can increasingly win public support for these alternatives and strengthen the role of those verlichte elements within the ANC who are worried about declining growth and where current policies are taking the country. Thank you.
Wow, that certainly is eye-opening. I mean, if I've understood you right, I look at it and I own a number of properties here in South Africa, and if I've understood you right, my I could have a challenge there in terms of eliminating my land rights, not just mine but the whole country, which is which is something. And then I can't own a company. Someone actually asked a great question here, and they said, well, what happens if you can't find people that are 51%? Enough caliber or quality people to make up that 51%.
Right. Well, I don't think that would be seen as a relevant excuse. The point is that the requirements are there, and we need a little bit perhaps of explanation here in the sense that at the moment there are no criminal penalties for failing to comply with empowerment rules, but it does become more and more difficult to do business in the country through what's called the cascade principle. In other words, the bigger companies that do business with the state have to comply with these rules if they want contracts or they want mining licenses or other permits from the state. They won't get them without. And the bigger companies will have better BEE scores if they put pressure on the firms that supply them, because the better the BEE score of a supplier firm, the better the BEE score of the big purchasing firm. So in this cascade principle, you will see the smaller firms that don't directly deal with the government also finding themselves under pressure to improve their BEE scores. And if you don't have an adequate BEE score, bigger firms will simply look elsewhere. If they can't find enough 51% black-owned firms, they really are going to come under pressure to start transferring their own ownership to black South Africans so as to meet the requirement. I've had a number of smaller firms approaching me saying, for example, in the mining industry, that they can't keep supplying the big companies that are their primary customers unless they have 51% BEE ownership. So they face a stark choice. They either stop trading with their biggest customers or they go the 51% BEE route. And they're tending to do that in the hope that that will keep them alive and that they'll be able to nurture the skills and develop the capacities that will keep the company as a thriving enterprise.
And tell me, I mean, the other thing that I found fascinating is that same day that I met you, there was some fascinating presentations done by the lady from First Rand Bank, one of the top economists there, and she was talking about how our government debt over the last 5 years under the Zuma reign has increased from the late 20% to the late 40%. And if we continue this way, by 2017, we'll be at junk bond status. But on top of this, and you've even mentioned it, but on top of this, we've also got an impending 179 billion rand debt where we've got to be able to pay people for land claims.
That's right. We know that the government is enormously ambitious in all the plans and proposals that it makes, and it doesn't ever seem to give enough thought to where the money is going to come from. And I would agree that we face a real risk of being downgraded to junk bond status. I think we also need to recognize that our interest payments are already the fastest rising item on the budget. And by 2017-18, on existing projections, we're going to be paying something like 158 billion on interest, which is as much as we currently spend on health. So how on earth are we going to fund all these things that the government is planning or promising?
Yeah, no, it's certainly very, very confusing to me. I just wanted to, for those of you who, there are lots of questions coming through tonight, and Dr. Anthea said to me, obviously, from a timing perspective, we want to be able to answer some questions, but we're also very excited with a number of our clients, and most people know that we all that we're about is empowering and giving people access to information, and she's very kindly agreed to be part of the Wealth Movement event, which is on the 8th and 9th of October in Johannesburg, in Bryanston. And really, the intention there, this is not a sell-a-thon. It's not, come and run to the back of the room. We're going to sell you things. I get really, really frustrated that South Africans, when they hear bad news or get nervous, they make mistakes. Some of them run overseas and try and buy things overseas, and they lose a lot of money. And we put this event together not to make money out of the event, but to empower South Africans and to bring the best in South Africa. People like Dr. Anthea Jeffery and other wonderful, very successful South Africans and global leaders, and come together. And rather than a bunch of keynotes, we actually look at discussing, debating, sharing ideas, and coming up with solutions. And I think for South Africans, it's so critically important nowadays, with everything that you're showing us there, that there's clearly different scenarios. And I mean, I've still got hope after watching your presentation, because I still feel that as a passionate South African, there's something we can do. We need to stand up. We need to oppose this. But equally, we can't necessarily have all our eggs in one basket in case we don't get it right. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
No, I agree with both of those things. I think it is absolutely vital that we don't just give up. I think there is potential for reform, potential to strengthen the hands of the moderates, potential to defeat the ideology of the NDR. And what we have to do is really lay out a completely different vision for the country. The ANC's entire emphasis has been on redistribution and the goals of the NDR. But obviously, just cutting up the existing cake in a different way is not going to be enough to meet the needs of an expanding population. We have to grow the cake as well, and not enough attention has been given to that. And as I said before, for the IRR, we have this plan for prosperity, which has a whole number of really important elements of how we could solve the problems in education, about how we could help to overcome the healthcare crisis, about reforms to labor law that would help to price people into jobs rather than excluding them from jobs. There are any number of exciting ideas in the country being developed by civil society, by opposition parties, and there are vehicles for getting them out into the public arena through the media and so on. So it's terribly important that we should put our good ideas together, spread them as far and wide as we can, show that they are constructive, practical alternatives that truly will help to bring prosperity to all, that truly will give us a much better chance of that better life for all that the ANC has been promising since 1994. But there is, of course, the risk we don't get it right. We need to try very hard, in my view, to achieve that. But at the same time, if people want to start looking at opportunities elsewhere to give themselves some sort of a cushion, that makes sense.
But just quickly, in terms of, I've got a whole lot of questions here. I just wanted to share with people just quickly before I get to the Q&A, in terms of what we're discussing. I mean, you talk about debate, and I think that's, as South Africans, we tend to sometimes bury our head in the sand, and I think really now is the time that, if we want to be part of the future, we need to be able to stand up. And one of the things that we put this whole event together is to have this debate, and for people to come along, and if they're concerned about where the state of things are at the moment, come along, start that conversation, and ultimately find that freedom for yourself and your family. I think, in terms of, where do you invest? Do you invest locally? Do you invest offshore? If you want to invest offshore, what countries do you invest in? Is it the USA? Is it Australia? Is it the UK? There's so many things to, there's great wealth opportunities here in South Africa. There's great opportunities overseas, but then what do you invest in? Do you invest in residential, commercial, funds, REITs, or financial instruments? And the purpose of tonight's not to go into this, but the purpose of this event is to answer this. How do you find the best opportunities, the best partners? How do you invest? What is the process? It's easy to say, I want to go invest in Australia, but how do you actually do it? How do you move your money offshore legally? How do you set up a tax-efficient local and offshore structure? I mean, we use Grant Thornton as our partners and have a worldwide structure to legally, own assets both locally and offshore. How do you manage your investments, especially when they're a long way away? Some people want to know about immigration. I personally hope that myself and Dr. Anthea and others can do something to live here for generations. I've been here for generations and I have no intention of leaving. But some people want to know what their options are. But I think one of the most important things is to be able to learn from the most successful South Africans about wealth creation, wealth preservation, a plan B, and peace of mind. And I think there's no one that sums it up better than Henny Besadenhout, who I look forward, Dr. Anthea, to introduce you to. He's my friend, my mentor, and my business partner, and a very, very wealthy and successful South African. And he said something to me in January. He said, we need to do this so that we can continue to live in South Africa because we want to live in South Africa, not because we have to. And I think that as South Africans, we truly can live in this beautiful country, but we also need to embrace being global citizens, and that's a fantastic thing for our country and for our continent. And it's a mindset shift that we need to go through. And the best way to learn that is from people like yourself and from who's not only worked here, worked overseas, and people like Henny and many others. That we need to now have that global view, basically.
Right, that makes sense.
I think the last thing really is in terms of technology is that, in the old days it was a lot harder, and now people can actually get access and do this and live in, whether it's Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban, or anywhere else. But technology allows you to co-create that future that you want and learn. And I mean, just in terms of some of our results, I think also, we've helped literally 2,400 South Africans invest overseas. We've invested over 1.3 billion on 5 different continents and have 19 books authored, including a few New York Times bestsellers. So, that's what I was talking about with someone like Dr. Anthea Jeffery with 11 different books and her knowledge and experience and some of the wonderful South Africans. And you bring it all into one melting pot. And it's just incredible what you can actually learn in terms of, the discussion, the debate, and ultimately finding solutions. So while I go through these questions, I just wanted to let people know, you can see the website there is Wealth Movement. I've given you Kevin, who's actually project managing the events, email, and also there's an SMS there if you want to SMS, if you want someone to call you back, I'll call you tomorrow. And for those that are on the website tonight, if you go in, there's actually a 20% discount if you just use the code EMPOWERED, which you can see down the bottom. And I'll explain a little bit about the packages just now. But Dr. Anthea, if you've got a couple of minutes, just 2 or 3 minutes, do you mind answering some of these questions? There's a load of questions that people have sent through to you.
Yes, sure. Let me try.
Okay, so let's see where we're at here. If government power was to shift, to what extent will the benefits derived by the state be kept in hands of those in power whilst legislating now?
Oof. I'm not sure. I think what we'd need to do is really have a big focus, say, on privatization. At the moment, we have a number of state-owned enterprises, such as Eskom, Transnet, and so on, South African Airways. They're not efficient, they don't work well. We believe we should have a kind of grand sale, and those SOEs should be privatized. At the very least, there should be effective partnerships that bring private sector efficiencies into their operation. And we've thought, but this is something that still needs more exploration, how would we best distribute the proceeds of privatization? When the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe embarked on a similar exercise, far too much of the value ended up in the hands of a few people, some of them whom we now identify as the oligarchs. We'd need to make sure it was a much fairer process, which began to give capital to the black South Africans who found it so difficult to acquire capital in the apartheid era, given all the racial restrictions on ownership and the like.
Okay, and then David says, does the EFF have a stake in the SACP as they're proposing the same thing to expropriate without compensation?
The EFF is, of course, an offshoot from the ANC. Julius Malema was earlier the president of the ANC Youth League. He's fallen out with President Zuma. But, of course, all his schooling was very much in the ANC, which means also very much with the SACP, because the SACP's dominance of the ANC has been really very strong for a long time. So he would have been schooled in the ideas that the SACP has. He now demands the expropriation of agricultural land without compensation at all, for example. And in that way, the EFF seems more radical at this point than the SACP, which would allow some compensation. It wouldn't be market value, and it probably wouldn't be enough to enable people to buy replacement assets. But the EFF at the moment is to the left of the SACP in this way. If in the end we have the Agri-Land Bill going through, the state taking custodianship of agricultural land, well then in fact we will have a very EFF type of plan for land, which may not involve the payment of compensation at all, which is a particularly worrying possibility.
Okay, and then what do we got here? Maria Decker said, is this webinar example of counteracting the threats of media freedom? I guess it would have to be done anonymously. So I never even thought of it, but I can tell you one thing, I've never hidden in a corner, nowhere in my life.
No, the IRR has always believed in speaking out. Some of our publications were censored in the old days by the apartheid government. And we know that many people think it's important rather to speak quietly to the minister and try and achieve more. And we don't think that works. We think you have to speak out, you have to develop the alternatives in public and build public support for them. And when you have that kind of public support for an alternative, then the minister will start to pay attention.
Then the DA, and sorry, there's a lot of questions here. So I'm going to leave a lot of them for when you and I are together, live at that World Movement event. But just one or two more, if you don't mind, and then let's say two more, and then we can do the rest when you and I are together. One I think is fascinating from Gavin is why are the DA and others so silent? As I said, even when I try and follow this stuff. It's critical. I own 3 farms in Zimbabwe. Half my heritage, so I'm not naive to this stuff. Or technically, on paper, I own them. And my point being is that when you were speaking 3 weeks ago, I was shocked by what I was hearing. Why is everyone else so silent?
I'm afraid that the media is not really adequately using its freedom to cover this kind of issue. It's long, complicated history of this, which I can't really go into. But the media has, in many ways, for a long time, turned a pretty blind eye to aspects of ANC ideology. They certainly turned a blind eye to the People's War that was waged by the ANC between 1984 and 1994, which was remarkably ruthless and destructive. But beyond that, there seems to be a kind of failure to engage adequately with the economic issues. We will spend a great deal of time on transformation. We will tend to endorse the government's views. There will be some criticisms of the fact that it's not working well for the poor, but generally a reluctance to engage deeply with transformation policies and why they are in fact so unsuccessful. And property rights are a very non-sexy topic. I think we have a media which often prides itself on being quite progressive, which means that it's more interested perhaps in what the state can do for society than what the market and business can do to put us on the path to prosperity. And I think all these factors come together with the result that the media doesn't pay enough attention to these sorts of issues.
Oh, fantastic. Listen, Dr. Anthea Jeffery, you did say you've had a 13-hour day, and I want to respect your time. And we've got some incredible questions here. And what we will do is I will make sure that we copy them all and that we actually send them over to you. And when you and I are live, maybe we can make some time to actually run through some of these incredible questions. But, I think it'll probably go on all night. I mean, I think, David said, how come it's the first time, he's hearing about the NDR? I must admit 3 weeks ago when I heard it from you, it was the first time I was hearing about it. And there's some incredible questions here from people. And I think that's why this webinar and the wealth movement are so important for people, because we need to get involved in this conversation, because otherwise, quietly, the country we're passionate about, literally could be going communism or and I'm not being negative. It's just from what you hear. And the thing is, we still have a chance to build this great country that we all believe in, I hope.
I believe we do, and I would certainly like the opportunity to go through those questions and do my best to answer them.
Fantastic. Well, listen, just for all of you that are online, you do have the details there. You can go to the website Wealth Movement. You will see that there are the different packages. In simple terms, the silver package is for those that want to attend and turn up for 2 days and literally learn from the best locally and the best globally. I mean, as an example, there's almost a full day course from Dr. Dolph Tarus, a world-recognized presenter and expert on international real estate. He's literally worked with Donald Trump, Tony Robbins, who else? Rich Dad, Poor Dad. He wrote Real Estate Riches, one of the most successful books ever written on international real estate. And I mean, his course goes for thousands of dollars, and yet because he's one of our partners, he's agreed to come here and effectively share for 2 days his wisdom and what's happening. For the gold partners, it's more of they get involved in the VIP discussions at lunch, and then for the platinum and diamond, you can go into the details, but that's more for the highly sophisticated and institutional investors that want to do some masterminds with someone like Henny Besaidnout that's listed 2 companies, one in Africa and one in Australia, and how did he build and grow his corporate and global portfolio. And then something else I thought that you might be interested, Dr. Anthea Jeffery, is that we very strongly believe in empowering women, and Hilda Lunderstead, who's one of our partners and shareholders, will be running a women's lunch at the event as well to empower women and to give them solutions, not just locally but also globally, and really start that conversation for women in terms of the challenges women face and what they can do in terms of empowering themselves and getting access to wealth. So I highly recommend that people go to the website Wealth Movement. I really look forward to spending some more time with you and really getting into the detail of some of these questions. And I want to thank you tremendously tonight for your time. It's been, as always, very, very enlightening. And I think we as South Africans, you're being very clear as to the what do they call that on a rock, a lighthouse. You're being very clear as to what the risks are, and we now need to be, as a boat, we need to take that into account.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for the opportunity to take part in this discussion.
Excellent. And thanks to all of you online tonight. As always, it's a pleasure. And we look forward to seeing you at the Wealth Movement on the 8th and 9th. If you've got any questions, SMS that number there, 072, hang on, can't read it there, 072-72-606-5642. If you want to email Kevin, email him or go to the website. But the one thing that I will say is that as South Africans, we cannot afford to not be part of the conversation. And so rather, and that losing to the Japanese on Saturday was one of the worst, lowest moments in my life. And let's rather finish the year on a high, be part of a conversation and be part of finding yourself solutions and empowering yourself. And that's why we say empower yourself, co-create a better future for yourself. Come along and be part of that conversation. And, don't be naive and don't think to yourself, oh, well, don't worry, I'll deal with this one day. Whether it's Dr. Anthea Jeffery or many, many other people, one day might be around the corner. And if I've learned one thing from my uncle, which is what I started off with tonight, it's those people that pre-plan, that have all the freedom in the world to make the decisions that they want for them and their family. And that's all that I'm passionate about. So with that, good night, and we look forward to seeing you there. Once again, thank you very much for your time.